Richard, please go ahead and introduce your team. Thank you very much, and we'll talk later.
Thank you, Ankel. My name is Richard Evans, the Shelter and NFI Sector Coordinator from UNHCR. And thanks for joining us on this focus on Libya. I would also like to introduce Zed Al-Jabari and Salah El-Barassi from NRC, who will also present today, and NRC are the co-coordinators of the sector. Libya is a very complex operating environment, and when I arrived, colleagues said to me, do not be fooled by the relatively low numbers and small beneficiary figures. There are in fact layer upon layer of issues that make operating in Libya very challenging. And I have to say, 4 months later, I'm still trying to understand the reality on the ground, where we should be prioritizing, and perhaps most importantly, what is going to happen as we approach the elections in December. So I hope today that we can give you a taste, a flavor of what it's like to operate in Libya, and show you some of the key work that we're doing as a sector. So what is on the menu today? In a minute, I'm going to hand over to Salah, who's going to talk about his country and the context. Then I will do some of the nuts and bolts about who we serve and response modalities. And I've picked out then 4 topics, key topics, which I think might be of interest to this group. I'm going to touch on the challenges, but only lightly, because I really want to leave the door open for Zed, who's going to come in and talk about the realities of what it means to actually program in Libya and respond to those needs. So with that introduction, let me hand over to Salah. Salah, please. Would you like to take us through the context?
Sure. Thanks, Richard, and thanks everyone. For this presentation. As Richard introduced me, I'm Salah El-Barassi from the NRC, the Shelter Coordinator Benghazi office. So I'm going to give you an overview about the Libya. For the past 10 years. What's going on in the last 10 years. So Libya, it's as everyone knows, it's in the middle of the Africa. Libya, before the 2011 was a country that considered as stable and economically and security on those levels. And after that, and it was under the Jamahiriya system of the government controlled by one person or one family. It's called the Gaddafi. Since the 2011, the revolution started in February, and since that time, the country started going to the instability in many levels. Economically, politically, and security. So in 2011, as I mentioned, that the revolution is happening, and after that, since that time, so the conflict started carrying on for the last 10 years. So the next conflict started in 2014. And it was starting from Benghazi, and it was, against the terrorism groups. And after that, start expanding to the east region of Libya. You can see here, in the red zone. And in 2019, the conflict start expanding to the west region, Tripoli and surrounding cities. And the country passed through the 3 conflicts, and in the 2020, they announced one government. It's called the GNU, which is established their missions. In the last January. And they try to put all the country, under one, government, but this government is still struggling, to their missions. Especially, to get their budgets from the HOR, the House of Representatives, still rejecting their budget and their estimated for the reconstruction for the country. And all these 10 years of conflicts and wars, that's affected on the Libya context, and that causing many of issues, as my colleague Richard said, layers of issues in this country. So we can go to the next slide, please. So the first of issues, the armed conflict, I mean, that caused more than almost 400K remain displaced till this moment for the 2021. And the clashes and the fighting still continues between the different armed groups. And that's resulted in massive destruction of civil infrastructures such as the housing, hospitals, water, sanitation systems, and the electricity system as well. So more than 200K people in needs and shelter and infrastructure assistance across the Libya worldwide. And beside this, I mean, due of the conflicts that remaining many of the mines and the explosive hazards that, I mean, causing a lot of issues, I mean, for the civilian, even though they return back to their, I mean, to their areas or neighborhoods after the conflict is finished. And the second main point, I mean, that changed in the Libyan context is the lack of the political stability, which is the political stability continues to hinder reconstruction, the effort and the returns that, as I mentioned, and the issue that for this problem about the HOR, the rejecting or still not approved the GNU budget, I mean, that give a potential for another war or conflict gonna be happen. So, and the second point is the limited investment from local government in reconstruction, improving its infrastructure and public services, and separate governance and regulatory bodies established in the eastern and western parts of the countries. And even though the GNU still, I mean, on the government level. And thus, as well for the conflicts that affected on the, of course, for the economical and the living condition. So the economic over the past 10 years made worse by the COVID-19 make the situation worse and worse. And second thing, the lack of livelihood and the income generating opportunities and frequent and continuous power and fuel shortage. So the power is cutting off sometimes more than 12 hours on some areas and cities. As well, I mean, for the liquidity of in the banks and the change of the change rate of the Libyan dinar, I mean, since beginning of the last year, this is very, very obvious and clear affected on the Libyan context and make the situation and the people, I mean, the civilian are struggling more and more. That's all from my side. Richard, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Salah. Thank you for that insight. Now, for those of you who've been paying attention, you will have realized that we're not a cluster. We are, in fact, under the humanitarian architecture called a sector. And that's principally because we also serve the needs of the refugees and migrants. And I'm going to come on to that a little bit later. I've put a load of figures up for you. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of them. But let's start with the IDPs. In the last 12 months, we've seen that figure fall, which is great. However, based on our new analysis of the 2021 MSNA, we actually see the needs in terms of Shelter and NFI increasing in this group, because another year of displacement means that life is getting worse. Now, with those lowering IDP numbers, we are also seeing returnees going up. And this is great. Some of it is being driven by security, but also some of it is being driven by forced evictions. And this we see as a problem. So for some, the situation is stabilizing, but for many, there is issues there. Now, for the non-displaced, political turmoil, as we've just seen from Salah, economic woes means that life is getting harder for many, and their access to good accommodation and NFI is getting worse. Now, we could spend a day unpacking the differences between refugees and migrants in the Libyan context, but to summarize, Libya hasn't signed the 1951 Refugee Convention and doesn't have refugee and asylum laws. And so it doesn't recognize the right of asylum seekers or refugees. However, through negotiations, they do recognize that the situation for 9 specific nationalities is different. And so we refer to this group as refugees, and they can register with UNHCR. But in general, the situation of these groups is very similar. They face significant legal and administrative barriers to securing decent accommodation, but also to work. And I think the COVID situation has really impacted them hard because it's impacted on their labour, that informal labour market. So for them, as the red arrows show, the situation is getting worse. I'm going to come back to them in a minute because I think their housing situation is of particular interest. So we have 13 million, and that's split across 3 main pillars. We have 5% for infrastructure, 34% for housing, but the lion's share, 61%, is in essential household items. And I think you'll recognise there a lot of types of interventions that you would see in a country which is, you know, very much like a Middle Eastern country, an oil-rich Middle Eastern country. The difference, though, is the specialist kits for those rescued at sea and in detention. Currently, we have 5,000 detainees in 13 government-run centres. Now, many of these have been rescued at sea, and that's where they go. Others have been arrested, and that's where they go. And as you can imagine, in any of both of those sorts of situations, your need for physical assets is quite specialised. So there's a lot of thought gone into that. And I will say that these numbers are not static. They are constantly changing, which means our interaction and focus on the detention sentence is constant. Our 13 million is split between 6 agencies, the ones on the top 2 rows, and they are the ones with projects in the HRP, led by UNHCR and graciously supported by NRC. And I've mentioned the 4 agencies that are in the SAG, and I'm sure many of you can appreciate what a pleasure it is to only have 4 in a SAG. We're also joined by other people who are involved in the sector with different criteria and different money, highlighting UN Habitat, who are looking at legal land reform. And I think as we transition, hopefully, out of the humanitarian, their part will grow. And also ICRC, they are actors both in the housing sector, but also in the essential household items sector. So they are a coordination partner for us. Right, I've got four points of which I hope are interesting topics for you. The first one is the Eviction Task Force. Now, this is a joint protection sector and Shelter NFI sector collaboration. And we recognize that evictions is an issue, and we wanted to do a sprint on this subject. So we formed what looks like a twig for many of you, and it's a dedicated group with a TOR and time bound, and we look at advocacy, policy, tool development and guidance. So far, we've got 4 products out. We've got key messages for advocacy, which is then shared, and people can use that to make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about forced evictions. We have the forced eviction tracker. Now, this is a COBO-based tool which anyone can use, and it allows you to enter the details of an eviction, either at settlement level or household level. And that does 2 things. First of all, it allows us to get that data and look for trends, and so that we can support those advocacy messages. But it also allows us to do a response. And when we do a response, that's in line with the response guidelines. And here we have 17 key activities in 4 parts that guide partners. It's not an SOP because every eviction is different, but they help to guide partners on what their support should be. The last product we have is the information settlement sheets and the eviction risk index. We realized that without a CCM sector here, there was a bit of a gap. So that's the gap that we've stepped into naturally. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to combine social, political, economic and legal parameters together to see which of the sites and which of the areas are most at risk. The idea is that then we can start our discussions and our negotiations, our mediation, our advocacy early to try and get ahead of the curve. So that's the eviction task force. As I said, I wanted to return back to refugees and migrants. I know we are the global cluster, but I still think this is interesting for us all. We certainly don't have the answers to how to address refugee and migrant housing. It's extremely difficult and delicate. Let me try and get into some of the complexity of it for you. I put up four numbers, and they work in pairs. So first of all, you got 96% and 3%. As you can see, there's 96% don't have any agreement, or documented or undocumented. But we are not seeing a lot of evictions. We're seeing 3% of the evictions. Now, I've looked around the world for other figures. I came across a figure for London of 2%. So does this appear to be low? Yes, I think it does appear to be low. Refugees and migrants struggle to access the housing market. And so what we're trying to do is now look behind these numbers and to say, well, okay, maybe undocumented lease agreements doesn't lead in directly to evictions, but what else does it do? What is the impact of that? What is the uncertainty of that? Does that have an impact on your mental health? And does not having a lease agreement cause other issues such as arbitrary rental increases or maintenance issues? The other two figures also work together. The 39%. Now, when I say overcrowded, I'm talking about 6 or more people in a single room. 6 or more, and adults. Predominantly, this is adults. Why is that overcrowding so high? Well, it's a little bit to do with the 55% because there is a big issue of security and there is a certain amount of safety by numbers. But also, if your status in Libya is irregular and that your intention is to migrate further north, then you don't want to spend too much on accommodation. So you do live in these very harsh conditions. We are still trying to navigate this and work out what that means for us in terms of policy and guidance on how we should try and support people who are living in desperate accommodation issues. The third one I've put on there, we don't often talk about transition or deactivation of clusters or sectors. We often, we're all involved in such protracted situations now. It's not often a conversation we have, and there's very little guidance and support on this. So in Libya, if I was to tell you that last month they received 2 billion in oil revenue. So on average, that's 24 billion a year from sale of oil and gas. And then if I was to tell you that ECHO budget last year was 6 million euro for the whole year, would you then say, well, yes, we should be talking about transition? So what's interesting then is if you then pull out the reference module, page 38 of the YASC reference module, and you look at the two key criteria that are there to sort of kickstart that transitional discussion, I'm not sure we're there. I'm not sure the needs are significantly reducing. And as Salah demonstrated with some of that politics going on, I'm not sure that the government are ready for that role. So the last one I just wanted to put out there was cash and vouchers. I believe, like many of us do, that the Shelter and NFI sector cluster around the world has done more than many in embracing cash and vouchers. It really is a key modality for us. So coming to Libya was a bit like going back to the 90s, where there's a significant imbalance between in-kind distribution and cash and voucher. And then when you put against that this thriving market and this tradition of trade, it really is an interesting. Now, there are clear reasons why there are challenges around cash modality, and for some of our beneficiaries, it's really challenging. But I just want to put that out there that in our work, we think that the use of cash is there, but there are particular challenges in Libya. My last slide before I hand over to Zed is I want to look at the challenges. Originally, I had 2 pages here, so I've cut it down to 1 because there are a lot of challenges. New government. I mean, the new government has taken place in 2021, and as Salah said, the budget is only just, or has it been approved? Has it not been approved? It's only just coming to fruition. And then we have elections on the horizon in December, which are going to be a challenging moment. What that means for us is that we haven't yet identified a lack of government counterpart. Not that they don't, they won't embrace us, but it's very difficult to navigate around that. If you were to ask me today, what is the total damage remaining from the 2011 conflict? I couldn't tell you. The government doesn't have that data. They haven't collected it, and it's not, or it may exist in pockets, but it's not centralized. And there's no clear policy on compensation. So there's nothing for us to really key into there. I came from the global debate, as many of you know, and the global debate, a lot of was about localization. So I was super excited to come to Libya, to get back to the field and to have a go at localization. It's very difficult. There isn't that plethora of civil society organizations to engage with. The multiple target groups, it does impact on our work. For example, we have 2 MSNAs. So we have 2 sets for everything. And every policy that we write for say, helping IDPs, we then have to nuance for helping refugees and migrants. Access to the country. Visas are extremely difficult to get at the moment to get into Libya. And then even when you're in Libya, moving around is difficult because of the UXOs and COVID. And lastly, security is a long-running challenge. Zed, I hope I didn't say too many there for you, and I hope that you can now highlight through what you've done, how you are working to make such successful projects in Libya. Zed, over to you.
Yeah, this was perfect. Thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone for joining this presentation. My name is Zaid. I'm the Shelter Sector Co-Coordinator and also the specialist for NRC's mission in Libya, the Shelter Specialist. So I'm talking today about NRC's project. It's one of the biggest shelter programs in Libya. It's mainly aimed at improving access to housing and community infrastructure and basic services that are associated with this infrastructure. So the project mainly looks at areas with high density of refugees and IDPs and areas that have been directly affected by the conflict. And in the picture here, you see a medical center that was damaged around May or June last year in the latest conflict in Tripoli. And this was the only medical center serving a very densely populated city block with more than 5,000–6,000 people using the medical center on a monthly basis. And this was completely destroyed by the war, and it took us around 6 months to restore it. So can you please go to the next slide, Richard? So our project has 2 main components. One is housing. So the housing component looks at houses that have been affected directly by the fighting. So an example is one that you see in this picture. This is one of the houses in South Tripoli, an area where fighting stopped around June last year. And the program has been working also with long-term displaced and returning populations. So we're not only looking at recent conflicts, because like Richard and Saleh mentioned, the political instability, the poor economic situations, what we see like the translation of that on the ground is that we've seen IDP and returnee families who have returned, and 4 or 5 years later, they're still living in houses that are extremely substandard with very poor conditions because they cannot afford to do any rehabilitation works or upgrades. So, for example, in Benghazi, we're working with communities where the conflict actually ended in 2016, early 2017, but until this day, there was no real investment in reconstruction, no alternative solutions. So a lot of the houses still look like the one in the picture, and a lot of them have actually people returning to live there. And this is mainly the target group of our intervention. So the project works as much as possible with local communities and authorities to identify areas. And here, just touching on some of the challenges that Richard said, this is usually not that easy. Even something as similar as reaching out to a new community, seeing who's there, who you can work with. In Libya, and especially in the West, there's lots of always constantly changing dynamics and control of the different territories. So you can find yourself talking with 2, 3 different bodies or authorities, driving less than 15 minutes in one neighborhood. So negotiating access is very difficult. Also, one thing that Richard mentioned that's very that makes our work much more difficult is mines and explosive hazards. So in this neighborhood, the one that's showing in the picture, for example, and after around now 12 months of the conflict ending, there is still very little around which areas are safe, which areas can be accessed, any maps that show like where was the demining activities happening. So we often find ourselves in positions where we need to actually rely on demining teams to be with us physically in the field, so we know which buildings we can approach and which buildings we cannot. So once we navigate all of that, the project mainly look at reaching out to people, doing vulnerability assessments to see who is the most vulnerable, and then looking at the scope of works. And this is also another point that is not quite easy because there's absolutely no data or evidence around the exact scale of the need. So you can be working in one neighborhood and not able to access other areas with very little knowledge or information about the needs, especially that you get a lot of contradicting numbers and information depending on who you talk to. And sometimes this is being like linked to a certain agenda or a certain reconstruction fund that is about to appear or disappear, but it's very hard to get a real sense of the exact needs. But what struck me the most is still after years and years of conflict in Libya, you go to areas where the conflict has stopped for many years now, and you still see a lot of basic and humanitarian needs. So back to how we work is we work usually with the homeowners either living or intending to return to these properties to design the scope of work. So we make sure that the scope of work is like the priorities of the household is well reflected there, and we prioritize areas such as safety, security, access to water, and access to sanitation within the limited budget we have. And then a team of engineers also goes in to ensure structural safety, that we have no structural issues, and then the actual rehabilitation works will happen. And that, going back to what Richard mentioned about liquidity, we use only one modality, which is we work with contractors to do the rehabilitation, and it's mainly because you don't have any other options. So for very long period, cash is not available in the country. Even as organizations, you cannot get any, like you have access to very, very little amounts of cash on a monthly basis. Any beneficiary-led modality with cash or voucher is not really possible. The only modalities that will work is contractors who can deal in bank transactions in a certain manner. So that also limits a lot the manner of the work, but we try as much as possible at least to provide technical support and guidance to the beneficiaries as we go through the process. And this is mainly to the so this is mainly it about the housing program. So far, we've done around 700 houses across Libya since 2019. And our second component of the project, which is less complicated maybe in implementation, is the infrastructure component, where we look at promoting access to basic services such as health, education, water, or electricity. Again, lots of these huge residential areas have been affected quite severely by the fighting. We see lots of neighborhoods with no power networks, no running water networks, sewage systems that have been damaged, no hospitals, no schools. And this is either preventing people from actually returning, or for those who have no option other than returning, it means that they end up in a position where their access to very basic services is very limited. So the project mainly prioritized, and especially last year with the COVID pandemic, we mainly prioritize now health facilities, schools, and also water and sewage systems. And we've done around 25 projects across Libya in the past 2 years. And also maybe one last thing that I mentioned, one that I forgot to mention about the housing project now came to mind, is one of the biggest challenges that we face is housing and land property issues, because even before the war, Libya had a lot of issues in terms of housing and land, proper housing and land, but even now it's made much worse, going to 10 years without proper civil registries where you can document any transactions or buying or leasing or selling any plot of land or a house. So also quite often we find ourselves in a position where people either cannot go back because of that, or cannot prove their ownership, or they are unable to access assistance due to legal disputes. And this continues to get worse and worse due to the lack of the political stability that would drive structures that would address these quite complex issues. So I think this is mainly it from my side, and I will hand back to Richard, or if anyone has questions. Thank you. We can't hear you, Richard. You're muted.
Thanks, Ed, and respect to you and all the partners for the work that you do on the ground. It's not an easy operating environment, as I think we have demonstrated, but there are a lot of work being done and a lot of progress against our HRP targets. We are a well-funded operation, so that's on the positive. Any questions? Would anyone like to go back or go forward, or dig a little bit deeper into anything that we've said or anything that we haven't said today?
Hello, Richard. Hi.
Please.
Hi. Nice to meet you all. Richard, I think we have met before previously. I remember. Thank you so much for the very good presentation. I work with Radar UK.
Okay, congratulations.
Thank you. I had contacted you when I was looking for a job.
Yes. So nice to hear.
Yeah, thank you. I work as technical coordinator. We provide trainings for related to shelter and wash and all other sectors. I just was wondering, what are those 9 nationalities that are recognized by the Libyan government that they will protect their rights? And the eviction rates are low. Is it for the IDPs or for the refugees as well? For the IDPs, makes sense, but for the refugees, is it because that refugees are using this location as a transition point, like in Hitsats refugee camp in Ethiopia? Like, do they come and move and then they give that particular shelter to another refugee who is fleeing through Libya? And also, I wanted to ask Ziad, I think it was, sorry if I have taken your name. How much do they cost per shelter? Do you have any kind of idea? Sort of, those houses seem very expensive to rebuild or rehabilitate. Looks like concrete and mortar. So, or just for the sake of comparison. Thank you.
Zed, do you want to go first?
Sure. So thank you for the question. Actually, the amount per shelter varies depending on the level of the destruction. So the picture we've seen is one that is like would qualify as the most damage that we deal with. So something like this would cost us around $4,000 to $5,000, and this is the very basic. And this is for exceptional cases where the families are extremely vulnerable and it's justified to invest as much, but usually the average per shelter is around $1,400. And this is for very basic work. So we're talking about having one functional water source per house, having a gate that locks at least one room that is protected from the elements, and some manner to discharge sewage.
Okay, thank you very much. And you might have this, someone asked already, self-built kind of. Do you involve the beneficiaries in any sort of construction so they can learn some skills, or is there any bit involved in such?
Again, what I mentioned, self-help is definitely my favorite or my preferred approach to engage in projects like this, but due to the lack of liquidity and the fact that most of our beneficiaries do not have access to banks outside Libya where they can get money, this was not possible. And also, like when you talk, even voucher system is not very doable if you're talking about like some of the semi-urban rural areas where the populations are quite spread. You don't have a lot of construction suppliers nearby. People have to travel a lot. So that in a way pushed us towards working with contractor-led modalities where we engage big construction companies to do this. And as for the involvement, we, as much as possible, we try to involve the beneficiaries at the design stage. So when we're deciding on the work scope per each house, we try to have them involved in that process. So it actually reflects their top priorities and needs, not only done in a way that's based on a technical assessment solely.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. I mean, I will highlight your project in Tawaga, which you hope to use as cash modality. And there are other partners who are getting into the cash, but it is, like I say, it is challenging. When we say liquidity, what we mean is there's no money in the country. You cannot go to the bank and get cash. Your other questions, yes, thank you. I knew someone was going to ask about the 9 nationalities, so I'm pleased it was you. So originally there were 7. So it was Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. Now, and I will let you I'll let you figure out why they were chosen. So originally those were the original 7, but then under a further negotiation, they were also added. They also added South Sudan and Yemen. So those are the 9 nationalities where the authorities recognize that they have they're in a different context. So they have a pathway for additional support. Yes, thank you for picking up on the evictions. Like I say, the migrant housing is really interesting, and it's a whole topic of itself. But when we see, at the moment, we're seeing a lot of evictions, they are the IDPs. So they are those who have fled throughout the different conflicts. Those are the ones who are facing evictions now. There is evictions going on migrant and refugee population, but it's a much more fluid. And as you alluded to, there are some key reasons for it.
Thank you, Nurullah. So I guess, Richard, if you want to have any last words?
No last words from me. Just to say, we will all be looking forward to peaceful and open elections at the end of the year, and hopefully to see Libya transition and regain the stability and the peace that it deserves. So I hope everyone will have their fingers crossed for December.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the insightful presentation, to you and to the rest of the team from NRC. And just to say that next week there will be another recess on country presentations, but instead we will have a presentation to launch the last edition of Shelter Project's publication. So this is what we will have next Wednesday at the same time, 2 p.m. Geneva time. And then we will continue with country presentations from the following Wednesday, starting with Iraq. So we welcome you next Wednesday for the launch of the Shelter Project's new document, and then the week after that for the next Iraq cluster presentation. So thank you very much to all, and please keep participating. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ankel. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.